September 1851, Selma, Alabama. The Alabama sun had barely kissed the horizon when Priscilla's eyes opened in the cramped quarters she shared with 7 other women. September 1851 brought with it the oppressive heat that seemed to seep into every board of the slave cabins, making sleep fitful and dreams troubled. At 23, Priscilla possessed a quiet strength that the other enslaved people recognized. She was the one they came to when children fell sick, when hearts broke from another family separation, when hope seemed as distant as freedom itself. Her hands, scarred from years in the cotton fields and kitchen work, smoothed the coarse fabric of her Sunday dress. It was the same dress she'd worn for 5 years, mended countless times with scraps and prayers. The morning light filtering through the single window caught the silver threads in her tightly braided hair, premature gray earned through sorrows that would have broken lesser spirits. Outside, the plantation bell began its mournful call, echoing across the 1,000 acres of Whitmore's cotton empire. Spanish moths swayed like ghosts from the ancient oaks, and somewhere in the distance, a mockingbird sang the songs of a dozen different birds, a creature that survived by learning to become something else, just as she had learned to survive. The other women stirred around her, beginning their Sunday ritual of preparing for the mandatory service at Whitmore's private chapel. They would sit in the back pews, heads bowed, listening to words about salvation that never seemed to reach their quarters. They would sing hymns about freedom in the sweet by and by, while chains of the here and now bound their every step. "Morning, Priscilla," whispered Mary, the eldest among them at 45, her voice barely audible. "You sleep any?" Priscilla shook her head. For 3 days now, sleep had been a stranger. For 3 days, her mind had churned like a mill wheel, grinding the same terrible thoughts over and over. Her youngest brother, Samuel, was gone, sold to a trader heading west toward the Mississippi. Gone like smoke, like a prayer whispered into an empty sky. The memory of that terrible Wednesday burned in Priscilla's mind like a brand. She had been in the kitchen, preparing Master Whitmore's breakfast, when she heard the commotion outside. Through the window, she saw the slave trader's wagon, its iron-barred windows and heavy locks unmistakable. Her blood turned to ice water in her veins. Samuel had been working in the stable, tending to Master Whitmore's prize mare. At 15, he still carried the innocent hope that somehow things might get better, that their master's occasional kind words meant something real. Priscilla had tried to protect that hope, even as her own had withered like cotton under a merciless Sunday. She had run from the kitchen, her heart hammering against her ribs like a caged bird, but she was too late. Samuel stood in chains beside the wagon, his young face streaked with tears, looking back at the only home he'd ever known. The trader, a thin man with cold eyes and tobacco-stained teeth, was counting out bills into Master Whitmore's palm. "Master, please," Priscilla had begged, falling to her knees in the red dirt. "You promised. You said you'd keep families together. Samuel's just a boy." Master Whitmore had looked down at her with the same expression he might wear when stepping around a puddle of mud. "Business is business, Priscilla. I've got debts to pay. The boy's young and strong. He'll fetch a good price in the Mississippi markets." "You gave your word," she whispered, the words torn from somewhere deep in her chest. "My word?" He laughed, a sound like glass breaking. "To you? Girl, you forget yourself. My word is for men of standing, not for property that talks." She had watched the wagon roll away, carrying her brother toward a fate she couldn't bear to imagine. The dust kicked up by the wheels had settled on her face, mixing with her tears to create muddy tracks down her cheeks. In that moment, something fundamental had shifted inside her, like a bone breaking and setting wrong. That night in the quarters, she had held Samuel's few possessions, a carved wooden bird he'd made, a smooth stone from the creek, a page torn from a book he'd been learning to read in secret. The other enslaved people had tried to comfort her, but their words seemed to come from a great distance. Old Isaiah, who claimed to have seen nearly 70 summers, had placed his gnarled hand on her shoulder. "The Lord works in mysterious ways, child," he'd said in his gentle voice. But Priscilla had looked up at him with eyes that seemed older than his. "Does he, Uncle Isaiah? Does he really? Or does the devil just work louder?" Now, 3 days later, Priscilla sat in the back pew of the Whitmore family chapel, a small wooden structure that Master Whitmore had built more for show than for devotion. The white congregation filled the front rows. The Whitmores, their overseer Jenkins, and neighboring plantation families, dressed in their Sunday finery. The enslaved people occupied the rear benches, heads properly bowed, hands folded in their laps. Reverend Morrison, a thin man with a voice like honey poured over broken glass, stood at the pulpit, reading from Ephesians. Slaves, obey your earthly masters with respect and fear, and with sincerity of heart, just as you would obey Christ. Priscilla's jaw clenched. How many times had she heard these same verses twisted to justify their bondage? How many sermons about patience and submission while their bodies were bought and sold like livestock? The Reverend's voice droned on about the divine order, about how suffering in this life would be rewarded in the next. Master Whitmore sat in the front pew, nodding along approvingly, his wife beside him fanning herself with a delicate lace fan. Their 2 young children, a boy of 10 and a girl of 8, fidgeted beside their parents, already bored with the familiar words. Beneath her shawl, Priscilla's fingers found the handle of the kitchen knife she had taken that morning. It was a heavy blade, well sharpened from years of preparing meals for the master's table. She had been using it just yesterday to slice ham for the family's dinner, never imagining it would serve a different purpose today. The Reverend moved on to the parable of the unfaithful servant, speaking of the master who forgave his slaves enormous debt, only to see that same slave refuse mercy to a fellow servant. The irony was not lost on Priscilla. She had heard Master Whitmore speak often of Christian forgiveness, yet he had shown no mercy when Samuel begged to stay. Around her, she could feel the weight of her people's resignation. Mary sat beside her, tears silently streaming down her weathered face, as she thought of her own children, sold years ago. Young Thomas, barely 18, stared at his hands, his spirit already broken by months of brutal treatment under Overseer Jenkins. Old Isaiah nodded along with the sermon, his faith still somehow intact despite decades of suffering. But Priscilla felt only a cold, crystalline clarity. The time for prayer and patience had passed. The time for hoping that Christian charity might touch their master's heart was over. Samuel was gone, and no amount of scripture was going to bring him back. She thought of her mother, who had died 5 years ago from a fever the master wouldn't pay to treat. She thought of her father, sold when she was 12 to pay for Master Whitmore's gambling debts. She thought of the children she would never have, because bringing new life into this hell seemed too cruel to bear. The Reverend's voice seemed to fade as Priscilla rose from her seat. The wooden pew creaked softly as she stood, but in her mind, the sound was as loud as thunder. And so we must remember, Reverend Morrison was saying, that our trials in this life are but preparation for the glory that awaits. His words died in his throat as he saw Priscilla walking down the center aisle. Every head in the chapel turned to stare at this unprecedented breach of protocol. Enslaved people did not leave their designated area during service. They did not walk among their betters. They certainly did not approach the altar with the slow, measured steps of someone who had made peace with destiny. Master Whitmore half rose from his pew, his face flushing red with indignation. "Priscilla, what in blazes do you think you're doing? Get back to your seat this instant." But Priscilla continued walking, her bare feet silent on the wooden floor. In the back pews, the other enslaved people watched with a mixture of terror and awe. They sensed that something momentous was happening, something that would change everything, though they couldn't yet comprehend what. Mrs. Whitmore clutched her children closer to her, some primal instinct warning her of danger. Overseer Jenkins reached for the whip he always carried, even to Sunday service, but found himself frozen by the look in Priscilla's eyes, not the desperate fury of a cornered animal, but the calm certainty of someone who had already won a victory they couldn't yet see. "Priscilla," Master Whitmore said again, his voice carrying the authority of a man accustomed to instant obedience, "I'm warning you." She stopped directly in front of his pew, and for a moment, the chapel fell into absolute silence. Even the insects outside seemed to pause in their buzzing. When she spoke, her voice was quiet but carried clearly to every corner of the room. "You sold my blood," she said, her words cutting through the morning air like a blade through silk. "You broke your word before God." Master Whitmore's face contorted with rage. "How dare you speak to me that way? Jenkins, get this slave back where she belongs!" But Priscilla was already moving. The knife appeared in her hand, as if by magic, the blade catching the morning light that streamed through the chapel's single stained glass window, a window depicting Christ's crucifixion, paid for with money earned from the sale of human souls. Master Whitmore had no time to cry out, no time to raise his hands in defense. The blade found its mark with the precision of years spent slaughtering hogs and preparing meat. Once, twice, 3 times it fell, and with each stroke, Priscilla felt the chains around her soul begin to crack. The sound that followed was unlike anything the little chapel had ever heard. A collective gasp of horror from the white congregation, screams from the women, shouts from the men. Mrs. Whitmore's fan fluttered to the floor as she gathered her children and pressed them against her breast, shielding their eyes from the sight. But in the back pews, the reaction was different. Old Isaiah's eyes widened with something that might have been wonder. Mary's hands flew to her mouth, but her eyes shone with a terrible, fierce joy. Young Thomas sat straighter than he had in months, his broken spirit stirring like a phoenix from ashes. Priscilla stood over her master's body, the bloody knife still in her hand, and felt something she had almost forgotten existed. The fierce, wild joy of a soul that had chosen its own freedom. She had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed, had committed an act that would seal her fate, but in this moment, she was more free than she had ever been in her 23 years of life. The chaos that erupted in the wake of Master Whitmore's death was unlike anything Selma had ever seen. Overseer Jenkins finally found his voice and began shouting orders, his face pale with shock and fury. Reverend Morrison stumbled backward from the pulpit, his sermon notes scattered across the floor. The white congregation surged toward the exits, women weeping, men cursing and calling for immediate justice. But Priscilla made no attempt to flee. She stood in the spreading pool of her master's blood, the knife loose in her grip, looking around at the faces of those who had held dominion over her for so long. For the first time in her life, they looked small to her, fragile, mortal, afraid. "Seize her!" Jenkins shouted, but his voice cracked like a boy's. "Don't let her escape." Several of the white men started forward, but something in Priscilla's posture gave them pause. She wasn't cringing or cowering as they expected. She wasn't begging for mercy or claiming madness as her defense. She simply stood there with the dignity of a queen, waiting for whatever would come next. In the back pews, the enslaved people remained frozen in a tableau of shock and awe. They had witnessed something that would be seared into their memories. Forever, one of their own had struck down the master, had proven that the powerful could bleed and die like any other mortal flesh. Mary was the first to move. Slowly, trembling, she rose from her seat and began walking toward Priscilla. Others followed Isaiah with his shuffling gait, Thomas with newfound steel in his spine, Sarah, who had been silent for months after her daughter was sold. They formed a circle around Priscilla, not to protect her from the consequences of her act, but to bear witness to her courage. "Get away from her!" Jenkins screamed, finally drawing his pistol. "All of you, back to your seats!" But for once, his commands fell on deaf ears. The enslaved people of Whitmore Plantation had seen their chains break in Priscilla's hands, and something fundamental had shifted in the balance of power. They could not save her, but they could honor what she had done. Sheriff Coleman arrived within the hour, summoned by a terrified messenger who had ridden his horse nearly to death getting to town. He was a big man with steel gray hair and cold blue eyes, a veteran of putting down slave rebellions across 3 counties. But even he seemed shaken by what he found in the chapel. "Good Lord," he breathed, looking down at Master Whitmore's body. "What happened here?" "That demon killed him," Mrs. Whitmore sobbed from where she huddled with her children near the door. "Cut him down like an animal during Sunday service." Sheriff Coleman looked at Priscilla, who still stood motionless in the center of the chapel. The other enslaved people had been forced back to their seats at gunpoint, but their eyes never left her face. "Priscilla," he said, his voice surprisingly gentle. "You know what you've done here?" She met his gaze without flinching. "Yes, sir. I know exactly what I've done." He nodded slowly, almost with respect. In 30 years of law enforcement, he had seen many killers, but few with the calm certainty that radiated from this young woman. She had committed murder, yes, but there was something in her bearing that suggested this was not the act of a mad dog, but of someone who had weighed the cost and chosen to pay it. "Put out your hands," he said quietly. Priscilla extended her arms, and he fastened the iron shackles around her wrists. The weight of them was familiar. She had worn chains before, in different forms. But these felt different somehow, lighter than the invisible bonds that had held her all her life. As they led her from the chapel, she heard Mary's voice rise in song, not one of the hymns they had been forced to sing during service, but an old spiritual from the quarters. "Wade in the water, children. Wade in the water, God's gonna trouble the water." One by one, other voices joined hers, until the little chapel rang with the sound of their song. It was a sound of mourning and celebration combined, a recognition that something had ended and something else had begun. They came for her at midnight, when the streets were dark and fewer witnesses would see what transpired. The mob had swelled to nearly 200 men, their faces hidden by darkness and the anonymity of collective violence. They broke down the jail door like a flood breaking through a dam, sweeping aside the token resistance of the few remaining deputies. Priscilla heard them coming, the thunder of boots on wooden floors, the crash of doors being flung open, the roar of voices united in a single terrible purpose. She stood and smoothed her dress one final time, preparing to meet her end with the same dignity she had shown in life. But when they reached her cell, they found her ready for them. She walked out under her own power, her head held high, her step steady. The men who had come to drag her to her death found themselves forming a kind of honor guard instead, escorting her through the streets of Selma toward the old oak tree at the crossroads. Word spread faster than wildfire. Windows filled with faces, white faces mostly, come to witness justice being done, but also darker faces peering from behind curtains and through cracks in shutters, watching one of their own write the final page of her story. At the crossroads, they had prepared a rope and a wagon. The crowd pressed close, eager for the spectacle. But Priscilla's calm presence seemed to create a bubble of strange quiet around her. Even the most bloodthirsty seemed subdued by her dignity, as if they sensed they were witnessing something larger than simple retribution. Colonel Matthews stepped forward to address the crowd, but Priscilla spoke first, her voice carrying clearly in the still night air. "I killed Charles Whitmore because he sold my brother," she said simply. "He broke his word and scattered my family like leaves on the wind. I could have borne many things, but not that. Some chains can only be broken one way." A murmur ran through the crowd, surprise, perhaps, that she would speak so plainly without begging or pleading. She looked out at the sea of faces, white and black, and saw the fear in their eyes. They were afraid of her, this slip of a woman who had dared to do what none of them could imagine doing. "My name is Priscilla," she continued, "and I want you to remember it. Remember that I lived, and I chose how I died. Remember that some spirits cannot be broken, no matter how heavy the chains." They hanged her there beneath the old oak. As the first pale light of dawn began to creep across the Alabama sky. But even as her body swayed in the morning breeze, her story was already taking wing, carried by the whispered voices of those who had witnessed her courage. In the quarters that morning, mothers held their children closer and spoke of the woman who had shown them that even the powerless could choose their moment, could say no more in a way that couldn't be ignored or forgotten. Her death became a seed that would grow in secret places, nurtured by the hope that if one person could find such courage, perhaps others could too.